The dust kicked up around Sarah's boots as she walked toward the old ranch house, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. 3 years had passed since she'd last set foot on this property. 3 years since she'd sworn she'd never come back. But here she was, drawn by circumstances beyond her control and a phone call that had shattered her carefully constructed new life. Jake's truck sat in the same spot it always had, rusted at the edges but still reliable, still him. She could see him through the kitchen window, his broad shoulders hunched over what looked like paperwork spread across the old oak table. The sight of him made her stomach twist with a mixture of longing and dread that she'd hoped time would have dulled. The Montana wind carried the scent of hay and horses, familiar smells that brought back memories she'd tried so hard to bury. This place had been her sanctuary once, when her world had fallen apart the first time. Jake had been her anchor, steady and strong, until the day he wasn't. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket, another message from her landlord in Denver, demanding the rent money she didn't have. Another reminder of how thoroughly her life had unraveled in the past 6 months. First the layoffs at the marketing firm where she'd worked for 5 years, then the medical bills from her mother's cancer treatment, then the slow slide into debt that had consumed her savings and her dignity. She'd exhausted every other option before calling Jake. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, not when she was 3 days away from being evicted and had nowhere else to turn. The conversation had been awkward, stilted, neither of them acknowledging what had happened between them all those years ago. He'd simply said she could come, that there was work at the ranch if she wanted it, that she could stay in the guest room until she got back on her feet. Now, standing in his driveway with everything she owned packed into 2 suitcases and a cardboard box, Sarah wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The guest room he'd mentioned was where she'd spent the happiest 6 months of her life, back when she thought they might have a future together. Back before she'd learned that love wasn't always enough to bridge the gap between 2 people who wanted different things from life. Jake must have heard her car because the front door opened before she could work up the courage to knock. He stood there in the doorway, taller than she remembered, his brown hair now touched with silver at the temples. His blue eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "Sarah," he said simply, her name carrying the weight of all the words they'd never said to each other. "Jake." She tried to match his neutral tone, but her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. He stepped aside to let her in, and she was struck by how little the place had changed. The same worn leather couch sat in front of the stone fireplace. The same family photos lined the mantel. The same coffee ring stained the end table where Jake always set his morning cup. It was like stepping back in time, except for the invisible barrier that now existed between them. "Coffee?" he offered, already moving toward the kitchen. "Please." Sarah set her bags by the door and followed him, her eyes taking in the familiar space. The kitchen had always been the heart of the house, where they'd shared countless meals and conversations, where she'd first realized she was falling in love with this quiet man who spoke more with his actions than his words. Jake poured 2 cups from the pot that was always brewing, adding cream to hers the way she liked it. The fact that he remembered such a small detail made her chest tighten with emotion she wasn't prepared to feel. "How's your mother?" he asked, handing her the steaming mug. "Better. The treatments worked. She's in remission now." Sarah wrapped her hands around the cup, grateful for something to do with her nervous energy. Jake nodded, and she could see the relief in his expression. He'd always been fond of her mother, had driven Sarah to the hospital countless times during those dark months before she'd left Montana. Her mother had asked about Jake for months after Sarah moved to Denver, and Sarah had never known how to explain why she couldn't talk about him without feeling like she was bleeding inside. "I'm glad," he said simply. "She's a fighter." They stood in uncomfortable silence for a moment. the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them like smoke. Finally, Jake cleared his throat and gestured toward the hallway. "Guest room's ready for you. Fresh sheets and everything." He paused, his fingers drumming against the counter in a nervous habit she remembered well. "Bathroom's still the same, towels in the closet." "Thank you," Sarah said, meaning it. "I know this is awkward. I wouldn't have asked if I had anywhere else to go." Something flickered across Jake's face, too quick for her to interpret. "You don't have to explain. We're friends, Sarah. We were friends before everything else." Friends. The word stung more than it should have. They had been friends first, bonding over their shared love of horses and quiet mornings and the way the mountains looked when the sun first touched their peaks. But friendship had grown into something deeper, something that had terrified Sarah with its intensity. "The ranch is struggling," Jake continued, turning back to his coffee. "Has been since beef prices dropped and the drought hit last summer. Could use an extra pair of hands if you're willing to work for room and board plus a little cash." Sarah studied his profile, noting the new lines around his eyes and the way his shoulders seemed to carry more weight than before. She'd been so wrapped up in her own problems that she hadn't considered he might be dealing with difficulties of his own. "What kind of work?" she asked. "Fence repairs, feeding the cattle, general maintenance, nothing you haven't done before." He glanced at her, a ghost of a smile playing at his lips. "That is, if you remember which end of a hammer to hold." Despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling back. "I think I can manage." The tension between them eased slightly, and for a moment it felt almost like old times, almost like they were just Sarah and Jake again, instead of two people carrying the weight of a broken heart between them. Jake's expression grew serious again. "There's something else you should know." "About why I said yes when you called." Sarah's stomach dropped. "What?" "My father died last month. Heart attack." Jake's voice was steady, but she could see the pain in his eyes. "Been dealing with the estate, trying to keep the ranch going on my own. Turns out the old man had more debts than I knew about." "Jake, I'm so sorry." Sarah set down her coffee cup, instinctively reaching toward him before stopping herself. "I had no idea." "No reason you would. We hadn't exactly kept in touch." There was no accusation in his voice, just a statement of fact that somehow hurt worse than anger would have. The reality of the situation settled over Sarah like a heavy blanket. She'd come here seeking refuge, thinking she was the one in desperate need of help, only to discover that Jake was fighting his own battles. The ranch that had always seemed so solid, so permanent, was apparently as fragile as everything else in their lives. "I should go," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "This was a mistake. You've got enough problems without me showing up and complicating things." "No!" Jake's voice was firm, final. "You're staying, but—" "Sarah." He turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his blue eyes made her breath catch. "You're staying. We both need help right now. Seems foolish to let pride get in the way of that." She wanted to argue, wanted to protect herself from the inevitable pain of being this close to him again. But the exhaustion of the past few months, the weight of her failures and fears, suddenly felt too heavy to carry alone. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." Jake nodded once, then picked up her bags without another word. "Come on, let me show you to your room." As Sarah followed him down the familiar hallway, past the bedroom they'd once shared, past the bathroom where they'd stood side by side, brushing their teeth like any normal couple, she wondered what she'd gotten herself into. Being here was going to hurt. She knew that much. But maybe, if they could both be careful, if they could remember to keep their distance, they might be able to help each other without tearing open old wounds. The guest room looked exactly as she remembered it, simple and clean, with a view of the mountains through the single window. Jake set her bags on the dresser and stood awkwardly in the doorway. Dinner's usually around 6, he said. Nothing fancy, but you're welcome to join me. I'd like that, Sarah replied, and was surprised to find she meant it. Jake nodded and turned to leave, then stopped. Sarah? Yeah? I'm glad you called. His voice was quiet, sincere. Whatever happened before, I'm glad you felt like you could still call. He left before she could respond, and Sarah sank onto the edge of the bed, her heart racing. 3 years of carefully maintained distance, 3 years of telling herself she was over him, and 5 minutes in his presence had reduced her to the same conflicted mess she'd been when she left. Outside her window, she could see the pasture where Jake's horses grazed, their dark shapes moving slowly through the golden afternoon light. This place had always had a way of making her feel both completely at peace and utterly vulnerable. Nothing, it seemed, had changed about that. The first week passed in a careful dance of politeness and shared labor. Sarah threw herself into the ranch work with a determination that surprised even her, rising before dawn to help Jake with the morning feeding, spending her days mending fences and mucking stalls until her muscles ached in ways she'd forgotten were possible. The physical exhaustion was a welcome distraction from the emotional minefield of living under the same roof as Jake again. They developed an unspoken rhythm, working side by side with minimal conversation, communicating mostly through gestures and shared understanding born from their time together years before. Jake would point to a section of fence that needed attention, and Sarah would gather the tools without being asked. She would start toward the feed bins, and Jake would already be pulling the truck around to load the hay. It was during the second week that the fragile equilibrium began to crack. Sarah was in the barn, brushing down Maggie, Jake's favorite mare, when she heard voices coming from the yard. Through the open barn door, she could see Jake talking to a woman in an expensive-looking SUV. The woman was blonde and polished in a way that immediately made Sarah conscious of her own dirt-stained jeans and tangled hair. She tried not to listen, but voices carry in the wide Montana air, and she couldn't help but catch fragments of the conversation. "Know this is difficult, Jake, but you have to be realistic. 3 more months, maybe 4, if I can get the cattle to market. Already have interested buyers. The land alone is worth more than you owe." Sarah's stomach twisted as she realized what she was witnessing. Jake was talking to a real estate agent. The ranch, his family's legacy, was on the verge of being sold. When the woman finally drove away, leaving Jake standing alone in the yard with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, Sarah stayed in the barn. She understood now why he'd seemed so desperate when she'd called, why he'd been willing to let her come back despite everything that had happened between them. He wasn't just helping her out of kindness or old friendship. He needed her help to try to save the only home he'd ever known. That evening, she found him on the front porch, nursing a beer and staring out at the mountains. The setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and red, the kind of sunset that used to take her breath away. Now it just made her sad, thinking about how many sunsets like this Jake might have left in this place. "Mind if I sit?" she asked, settling onto the porch steps before he could answer. Jake shrugged, taking another sip of his beer. Free country. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the light fade from the sky. Finally, Sarah couldn't stand it anymore. "I heard her talking to you today. The real estate woman." Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. "Why didn't you tell me how bad things really are?" Sarah pressed. "Would it have changed anything?" Jake's voice was flat, emotionless. "You still needed a place to stay. I still needed help with the ranch. It would have changed everything," Sarah said softly. "I wouldn't have come if I'd known I was just another burden for you to carry." Jake finally turned to look at her, and the pain in his eyes made her chest ache. "You were never a burden, Sarah. Not then. Not now." The simple honesty in his words cut deeper than any anger could have. Sarah wrapped her arms around her knees, trying to hold herself together. "How much time do you have?" she asked. "Bank's calling the loan in December. 4 months, give or take." Jake finished his beer and set the empty bottle on the porch rail. "Been trying to come up with the money, but unless cattle prices suddenly double or I find oil in the back pasture, I'm looking at losing everything my family built." Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. This ranch had been Jake's whole world for as long as she'd known him. His great-grandfather had homesteaded this land, and 4 generations of his family had worked to build it into something special. The idea of Jake losing it because of bad luck and circumstances beyond his control was almost unbearable. "What about selling some of the land?" she suggested. "Keep the house and enough pasture for a smaller operation?" Jake shook his head. "Tried that. Problem is, the land that's worth the most is what makes this place work. Sell off the water rights or the winter pasture, and what's left won't support a viable ranch." They lapsed into silence again, both lost in their own thoughts. Sarah found herself remembering the dreams Jake used to share with her, his plans for expanding the herd, maybe adding some guest cabins for tourists who wanted to experience ranch life. He'd been so passionate when he talked about the future, his eyes lighting up with possibilities. Now those same eyes held nothing but resignation. "There is one option," Jake said suddenly, his voice so quiet she almost missed it. "What?" "Linda, the real estate agent. She says there's a developer interested in the property. Wants to put in a resort, golf course, maybe some vacation homes." Jake's mouth twisted with distaste. "Pays enough to clear the debts and leave me with a decent nest egg." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. But it means this place gets turned into something it was never meant to be. All those city folks coming out here to play cowboy for a weekend, turning my family's legacy into some kind of theme park. The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah understood why the possibility tortured him. Jake had always been a man who valued authenticity above all else. The idea of his ranch becoming a manufactured experience for wealthy tourists would feel like a betrayal of everything he'd been raised to believe in. "Maybe it wouldn't be so bad," Sarah said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. At least the land would still be here. Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. Would it? Or would it just be some sanitized version of what it used to be? Sarah didn't have an answer for that, so she stayed quiet, listening to the sound of cattle lowing in the distance and the rustle of wind through the cottonwood trees. "I keep thinking about what my father would say," Jake continued. "He fought so hard to keep this place going, worked himself into an early grave trying to make it profitable. What kind of son am I if I just give up and sell out to developers? The kind of son who's doing everything he can in an impossible situation," Sarah said firmly. "Your father would understand that sometimes there aren't any good choices." Jake turned to study her face in the fading light. "Would you? Understand, I mean?" The question caught her off guard, loaded with implications she wasn't sure she was ready to explore. "What do you mean?" "If I sell to the developers, I'll have enough money to start over somewhere else. Maybe buy a smaller place in Wyoming or Colorado, somewhere the land prices haven't gone crazy yet." Jake's voice grew quieter, more hesitant. "Wouldn't be the same, but it would be something." Sarah felt her heart start to race as she began to understand what he was really asking. "Jake, I know things ended badly between us," he said quickly, as if he needed to get the words out before he lost his nerve. "I know I hurt you and I couldn't give you what you wanted. But these past 2 weeks, having you here again, it's made me remember why I fell in love with you in the first place." The admission hung between them like a spark in dry grass, dangerous and full of potential. Sarah's carefully constructed walls began to crumble, and she felt herself falling back into feelings she'd thought she'd buried. "Don't," she whispered, but even she could hear the lack of conviction in her voice. I'm not asking you to decide anything right now, Jake said, reaching over to touch her hand gently. I'm just saying that if I do start over somewhere new, I'd want you to think about starting over with me. For real this time. No more running. No more being afraid of what we might mean to each other. Sarah stared down at their joined hands, his calloused fingers intertwined with hers, and if the storm hit on a Thursday night in late October, howling across the plains with a fury that rattled the windows and sent the horses skittering nervously in their stalls. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching Jake struggle through the wind and rain to secure a section of barn roof that had torn loose. Even through the driving rain, she could see his determination, the way he refused to let the elements defeat him. It had been 6 weeks since their conversation on the porch. 6 weeks of careful politeness, punctuated by moments of electric awareness. Neither of them had mentioned Jake's offer to start over, but it hung between them like a promise waiting to be kept or broken. Sarah had spent those weeks watching Jake pour every ounce of his strength into saving the ranch, taking on extra work, selling off equipment and livestock to buy more time. She'd matched his effort with her own, working until her hands were raw and her back ached, driven by a desperate hope that somehow they could find a miracle. The miracle hadn't come. That morning, Jake had received the final notice from the bank. 3 weeks to pay the full amount owed or face foreclosure. The developer's offer was still on the table, but Jake had been putting off making a decision, clinging to hope that was becoming more painful by the day. When Jake finally stumbled through the kitchen door, soaked and exhausted, Sarah was waiting with hot coffee and dry clothes. "Bad?" she asked, though the answer was written in the grim set of his jaw. "Lost about 20 feet of roofing. Won't be cheap to fix." Jake stripped off his wet jacket and ran his hands through his dripping hair. "Hell, at this point, I'm not even sure it's worth fixing." Something in his voice, a defeat she'd never heard before, made Sarah's chest tighten with fear. In all the time she'd known Jake, through his father's death and the mounting financial pressure, he'd never sounded so close to giving up. "Of course it's worth fixing," she said, trying to inject confidence she didn't feel into her voice. "This is your home, Jake. Your family's legacy." Jake laughed bitterly. "Legacy? What legacy?" "I'm about to lose everything my great-grandfather built because I couldn't make it work. Some legacy." "That's not true, and you know it." Sarah moved closer, wanting to comfort him, but unsure if he'd welcome the contact. "You've done everything you could. The economy, the drought, your father's medical bills. None of that was your fault." "Doesn't matter whose fault it is," Jake said, sinking into a kitchen chair. "End result is the same. Come November, this place won't be mine anymore." The finality in his voice broke something open inside Sarah. She'd been holding back for weeks, trying to protect herself from hoping for something that might not happen. But seeing Jake like this, defeated and alone, stripped away all her careful defenses. "So that's it?" she asked, her voice sharper than she'd intended. "You're just going to give up?" Jake's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with sudden anger. "Give up? I've been fighting this for months, Sarah. I've sold everything I can sell, worked myself half to death trying to keep this place afloat. What more do you want from me?" "I want you to fight for us," Sarah said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I want you to fight for what we could be." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the wind howling around the house. Jake stared at her with an expression she couldn't read, and Sarah felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that made her want to run. "Is that what you want?" Jake asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "After everything that happened, after the way I let you down before, you'd really want to try again?" Sarah's heart was beating so fast, she was sure he could hear it. This was the moment she'd been running from for 3 years, the conversation they should have had before she left Montana the first time. "I was scared before," she admitted, her voice shaking. "Scared of how much I loved you, scared of what it would mean to build a life with someone whose world was so different from what I thought I wanted. I convinced myself you didn't want the same things I did, but maybe I was just too afraid to find out if we could make it work. Jake stood up slowly, moving toward her with the careful deliberation of a man approaching a spooked horse. And now? Now I'm terrified, Sarah said honestly. But I'm more terrified of walking away again, of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I'd been brave enough to stay. Jake reached for her hands, and this time she didn't pull away. His calloused fingers were warm and steady, anchoring her to this moment, this choice. The developer wants an answer by Monday, he said quietly. If I sell, there's enough money to start over somewhere new. Not here in Montana, but somewhere we could build something together. Sarah looked around the kitchen that had become so familiar again, thinking about all the history these walls held, all the dreams that had been born and died within them. Then she looked back at Jake, at the man who'd held her heart for longer than she'd been willing to admit. What if we don't have to start over somewhere else? She asked suddenly, an idea beginning to form. What if there was another way? Jake frowned. What do you mean? Sarah's mind was racing now, pieces falling into place with startling clarity. The guest ranch idea you used to talk about? What if we did that, but smaller, more authentic? Sarah, we've been through this. There's not enough time to set up something like that, and even if there was, we don't have the capital. But we have the land, and we have the skills, Sarah interrupted, excitement building in her voice. What if we offered the developer a partnership instead of a buyout? Let them handle the marketing and hospitality side while we run the ranch operations. Jake's eyes began to light with cautious hope. You think they'd go for something like that? I think it's worth finding out. Sarah squeezed his hands. It would mean staying here, fighting for this place instead of walking away. It would mean taking a risk on something we're not sure will work. Kind of like taking a risk on us, Jake said, understanding dawning in his expression. Sarah nodded, her throat tight with emotion. I'm tired of running, Jake. From you. From this place. From the life I was too scared to want. I want to fight for something instead of always looking for the exit. Jake pulled her closer, and Sarah could see her own hope and fear reflected in his blue eyes. If we do this, if we try to save the ranch and try again with us, I need you to know that I'm all in. No more holding back, no more being afraid of what we might mean to each other. I know, Sarah whispered, reaching up to touch his face. And I need you to know that I might mess this up. I might get scared again. Might try to run. But I don't want to give up without trying. Jake leaned his forehead against hers, and Sarah felt the last of her walls crumble. This was what she'd been running from all those years ago. Not just love, but the kind of deep, transformative love that changed everything. Then we'll figure it out together, Jake said softly. All of it. The ranch, us, whatever comes next. Outside, the storm was beginning to pass, the wind dying down to a whisper. Sarah looked into Jake's eyes and made her choice. Wound me if needed, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the settling house. Just don't leave me in the cold again. Jake's response was to kiss her, soft and tentative at first, then deeper as years of separation and longing melted away. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Sarah felt like she was coming home for the first time in years. They had a ranch to save and a future to build, and neither task would be easy. But for the first time since she'd returned to Montana, Sarah felt like they had a fighting chance. Sometimes the greatest victories came not from avoiding the storm, but from learning to dance in the rain. Outside, the first stars were beginning to peek through the breaking clouds, and Sarah thought she could see the promise of dawn on the horizon. Felt her world shift on its axis once again. 3 years ago, she'd left because she'd wanted commitment, and Jake had insisted he wasn't ready. Now here he was, offering exactly what she'd dreamed of, and all she could think about was how much they'd both lost in the years between.